From the Interpretive Reading Manual, reading a short story by Ambrose Bierce, who died in 1842, trying to interview Concho Villa, a short story writer known for his satirical wit and sardonic view of human nature, known as Bitter Bierce, who also was a writer for the San Francisco Chronicle. The story, The Boarded Window, and this is 8 to 10 minutes.
Normally, when you read from a book, you hold it in your left hand and you read from it this way. This is a big book, so I'm going to read from the lecture. In 1830, only a few miles away from what is now the great city of Cincinnati, lay an immense and almost unbroken forest. The whole region was sparsely settled by people from the frontier. Restless souls who no sooner had hewn fairly habitable homes out of the wilderness and attained that degree of prosperity which we would call indigence, then impelled by some mysterious impulse of their nature, they abandoned all and pushed further west. Many of them had already forsaken that region for the remoter settlements, but among those remaining was one who had been one of the first arriving. He lived alone in a house of logs, surrounded on all sides by the great forest, of whose gloom and silence he seemed a part, for one that had never known him to speak a needless word. His simple wants were supplied by the sale of a hunter of skins of wild animals in the river town. For an hour, I need bigger glasses. For not a thing did he grow on the land, which if needful, he might have claimed by right of undisturbed possession. There were evidences of improvement. A few acres of ground immediately about the house had once been cleared of trees, the decayed stumps of which were half concealed by the new growth that had been suffered to repair the ravage wrought by the axe. Apparently, the man's zeal for agriculture had burned with a failing flame, expiring in penitential ashes. The little log house had a single door, and directly opposite, a window. The latter, however, was boarded up. Nobody could remember a time when it was not, and no one knew why it was so closed. Certainly not because of the occupants' dislike of light and air, for on those rare occasions that a hunter had passed that lonely spot, the recluse had commonly been seen sunning himself on the doorstep, if heaven had provided sunshine for his need. I fancy there are a few persons living today who ever know the secret of that window. The man's name was said to be Murlock. He was apparently 70 years old, actually about 50. Something besides years had had a hand in his aging. His hair and long, full beard were white, his gray, lustreless eyes sunken, his face singularly seamed with wrinkles which appeared to belong to two intersecting systems. In figure he was tall and spare, with a stoop of the shoulders, a burden bearer. One day Murlock was found in his cabin, dead. It was not a time and place for coroners and newspapers. I suppose it was agreed that he had died from natural causes, or I would have been told and would remember. When Murlock built his cabin and began laying sturdily about with his axe to heave out a farm, the rifle, meanwhile, as means of support, he was young, strong, full of hope. In that eastern country from whence he had come, he had married, as was the fashion, a young woman in all ways worthy of his honest devotion, who shared the dangers and privations of his lot with a willing spirit and a light heart. There's no known record of her name. Of her charms of mind and person, tradition is silent. One day, Murlock returned from gunning in the distant part of the forest to find his wife prostrate with fever and delirious. There was no physician within miles, no neighbor, nor was she in a condition to be left to summon help. So he set about the task of nursing her back to health. But at the end of the third day, she fell into unconsciousness and so passed away. When convinced that she was dead, Murlock had sense enough to remember that the dead must be prepared for burial. In performance of this sacred duty, he blundered now and again, did certain things incorrectly, and other things which he did correctly were done over and over. He was surprised, too, that he did not weep. Surprised and a little ashamed. Surely it is unkind not to weep for the dead. Tomorrow, he said aloud, I shall have to make the coffin and dig the grave, and then I shall miss her when she is no longer in sight. But now, she is dead, of course, but it is all right. It must be all right somehow. Things cannot be so bad as they seem. He stood over the body in the fading light, adjusting the hair and putting the final touches to the simple toilet, doing mechanically with a soulless care. And still, through his consciousness ran an undersense of conviction that all was right, that he should have her again as before, and everything explained. He had no experience in grief. His capacity has not been enlarged by use. His heart could not contain it all, nor his imagination rightly conceive it. He did not know he was so hard struck. That knowledge would come later and never go. No sooner had he finished his pious work than sinking into a chair by the side of the table upon which the body lay, and noting how white the profile showed in the deepening gloom, he laid his arms upon the table's edge, dropped his face into them, tearless yet, and unutterably weary. At that moment came through the window a long wailing sound, like the cry of a lost child in the far deeps of the darkening world. But the man did not move. Again, and nearer than before, sounded that unearthly cry upon his failing sense. Perhaps it was a wild beast. Perhaps it was a dream. For Murlock was asleep. Sometime later, afterwards appeared this unfaithful watcher awoke, and lifting his head from his arms, intently listened. He knew not why. Then in the black darkness by the side of the dead, recalling all without shock, he strained his eyes to see he knew not what. His senses were all alert, his breath suspended, his blood had stilled its rides to assist the silence. Who, what had waked him, and where was it? Suddenly the table shook beneath his arms. At the same moment he heard, or fancied that he heard, a light, soft step. Another, sounds like bare feet on the floor. He was terrified beyond the power to cry out or move. He tried vainly to speak the dead woman's name, vainly to stretch forth his hand across the table and learn if she were there. His throat was powerless, his arms and hands were like lead. Then occurred something most frightful. Some heavy body seemed hurled against the table with an impetus that pushed it against his breast so sharply as to nearly overthrow him. At the same instant, he heard and felt the fall of something on the floor with so violent a thump that the whole house was shaken by the impact. A scuffling ensued, and a confusion of sounds impossible to describe. Murlock had risen to his feet. He flung his hands upon the table. Nothing was there. There is a point at which terror may turn to madness, and madness incites to action. With no definite intent, from no motive but the wayward impulse of a madman, Murlock sprung to the wall, groping for his loaded rifle, and without aim discharged it. By the flash that lit up the room with a vivid illumination, he saw an enormous panther dragging the dead woman toward the window, his teeth fixed in her throat. Then there were darkness blacker than before and silence, and when he returned to consciousness, the sun was high, and the wood vocal with a song of birds. The body lay near the window, where the beast had left it when frightened by the flash report of the rifle. The clothing was deranged, the long hair in disorder, the limbs lay anyhow. The ribbon which had bound the wrist was broken. The hands were tightly clenched. Between the teeth was a fragment of the animal's ear. Mr. Television.